How do we know if something from antiquity is authentic or not? Where does this information on the labels in museums come from? And turns out you can really ask those questions for your entire life.
Is it as simple as that these museums have so much to hide?
An activist who told me that he had found a photograph of an idol that had been stolen from its shrine in Nepal in the 1970s. And he had matched it to the object. He had located the object in a museum in Colorado. And he had sent the photograph to the object, emailed it along and said, hey, I think this was stolen and you shouldn't have it. And the museum had replied to say, we're satisfied with the current state of our provenance research. So he sent this all to me and said, does that mean there's nothing we can do legally? And I said, oh, no. That's museumese for go F yourself.
Imagine walking through a grand museum, the British Museum in London, or for those across the pond, the Met in New York. You'll very quickly find yourself surrounded by ancient artifacts and priceless masterpieces. But how many of these objects were obtained ethically? How many have stories of theft, forgery, or outright deception hidden beneath their polished displays? Today, I sit down with Professor Erin Thompson, America's only full-time professor of art crime. She spent years uncovering the murky underworld of looted artifacts, museum scandals, and forgeries that fool even the most seasoned collectors. Art isn't just about beauty, it's about power, history, and sometimes crime. This is Ramblings of a Sikh, and today we're pulling back the curtain on the world of art crime. So let's begin. I just want to kind of start with yourself, if you don't mind, which is kind of like, who are you, what's your background, and was this of interest at an early age?
No, because now I spend all of my time in museums, but I didn't know that museums were a thing when I was growing up. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, which it's a wonderful place. You don't need to go to museums because there's culture just vibrant and living, a very multicultural place. And I started to think, art is interesting in high school when taking a class, and then I went to New York for college and visited the Metropolitan Museum for the first time and really never left.
Never looked back. Yeah. Were you always interested in history, art, stuff like this? Or was it just kind of a natural bubbling kind of interest? As in you were looking at, I don't know, like as you mentioned, you went to the Met, kind of fell a little bit more in love with it, and then that kind of spurred you on a little bit more.
I finished my undergraduate and entered a PhD program in art history, in ancient Greek and Roman art history, and I completely accidentally fell down this rabbit hole of the art market and forgery and smuggling because I was, for my dissertation, writing about some vases, which are very weird. So they're painted pots that have parodic images on them. So it's gods and heroes, but instead of the usual imagery of them conquering monsters and demons and whatever and being buff and calm, these vases show like Zeus running away in fear and dropping his weapons, and they're very weird. So it turns out that they were painted in honor of Dionysus at festivals of wine. So they showed that the power of wine, the power of Dionysus can overcome even the other gods, because confusion and cowardice were something the Greeks thought would happen if you drank too much. But before I figured this out, I was reading other scholars who said these must be fakes because there's no way the Greeks would have made something so weird. And I started to think, how do we know if something from antiquity is authentic or not? Where does this information on the labels in museums come from? And turns out you can really ask those questions for your entire life.
and never find out.
Yeah. So I realized that, say, the Met, most of its objects in the Greek and Roman gallery, they bought from the marketplace. So they didn't excavate them. They really have no idea exactly where they came from in a lot of situations. And even when they do have the idea, they don't tell us so often. So you'll go into the Met and you'll see a label that says, said to be found near Athens. And that's just weird. Like,
What does that
especially
mean?
for a sculpture, it's made out of stone, and you can't scientifically date the age of stone. It's all old. So I wanted to know more. So I've been for many years trying to find more information in archives, trying to figure out the scientific testing of things, trying to trace the histories of the marketplace. But it was only a few years ago that I turned some of my attention from this ancient Mediterranean art to the art of living cultures. When I started working with folks in Nepal to make repatriation claims for objects. Well, I shouldn't even really call them objects, because for many folks in Nepal, these are deities. So it's not a question of let's transfer something from a museum display case in New York to a museum display case in Kathmandu. It's let's take something that had been stolen from worship, from a shrine, and had been forcibly transformed into art in a museum, and then take it back, place it back into the shrine, and place it back into worship.
It's really interesting because I had someone message on Instagram the other day, and in a similar context, there are loads of historic. So within the Sikh tradition, the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji is the pinnacle of our religion. Like, that is kind of our the item that we venerate, and where all of our scripture comes from. There are historic copies of those sat in the University of Manchester, in the University of Oxford, Cambridge, I think, and there's definitely a few in the British Library. And in the same context as those Nepalese people, the Guru Granth Sahib Ji shouldn't be on a shelf. It should be kept in its rightful way. So it's interesting to see how this occurs across cultures, across religions, and across the globe. But just coming to the thing that I guess ties them all together, which are the museums. And is it as simple as that these museums have so much to hide? That's why these tags are so kind of not precise. As in, like, why are these museums, like, considering they're meant to be the institutions that look after this heritage and care for it and whatever other words we want to attach, why is it then that places like the Met and other places, like, it's not just the Met, you can take the British Library, I've even seen things on the Durham University collection, these are Sikh items that have just been completely incorrectly labelled. But why then is there such a almost not, like, it almost seems as though these institutions do not want to deal with it, and they don't want to actually look at it, so they're happy to say, oh, it was found near this or whatever. Like, from your understanding and research, like, what do you think of that context?
Oh boy. How many hours is this podcast?
As long as you want.
Well, I'll give a very professorly answer saying it depends, because I'm very hopeful for change in museums. I think there are very few people at museums who are 100% convinced that it is the best thing for them to have all of these objects and nothing should go back, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of people pushing for change, but you're turning around a very large ship. So the way that objects move between cultures and are displayed in Western museums is very tied into a whole history of extraction, whether it be natural resources or people or anything. It's tied into self-conceptions of what's that were rooted in ideas of superiority, of cultural or racial superiority, and it's hard to see how those have fallen out in the museum world. But I think many people are now realizing, oh, this is not a neutral way of sharing culture with the world. This is something that is very historically determined, and that is not even consistent with the goals of the museum. So what is the museum supposed to do? Educate us, show us beauty, But as you just said, there's so many cultural objects in museums that are mislabeled because they were taken by people who did not know. And so one thing that is happening now is not just repatriation claims to empty out a museum, but collaboration is happening. The Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford is a good example of this, where they are actively inviting in representatives from source communities and saying, do you want these things back? If you don't necessarily want them all back, how can we do it better? And people will say, sure, we're glad you're sharing our culture with the world, but maybe you could hang this one the right side up because it's upside down, or we love that you have preserved these manuscripts and are digitizing them, but this one and that one are supposed to only be read by initiates, so maybe you could put on a password and we can control who gets the password, that kind of thing. But yeah, what are the historical roots? So there's sort of these very dark roots of not collecting information. There are also just issues of time and expense. It's very time consuming and very expensive to do this type of provenance research, especially if it wasn't collected well at the beginning. And there are few people who are skilled at this. So I see the process going on in many museums, but it's going to take a while. And then you start to run into questions of like, well, how complete does our understanding have to be of where a particular object came from before it should be returned? I think, I fall on earlier in that process, and a lot of museum people fall on later in that process. But I do know there are some cases in which the information is deliberately kept concealed. And I'm hoping that will be a decreasing tendency in the museum world, but we'll see. I mean, encouragingly, I have realized over the years that information has been spread. So if there is an object in some museum that is very locked down about its information, I might not be able to find out about it from that museum, but I can find letters from the dealer who sold it offering it to another museum in that other museum's archives, or the same with private collectors. So you can eventually track down a whole lot of stuff.
I have a load of questions I want to ask you, but one that's really got my attention is like, and this is also because of my own personal interest. So I think I was actually the victim of a forgery off an art exhibition, and it was I verified it with one of the country's top end Sikh art dealers, and he was like, yeah, I've never heard of this guy's name, the art doesn't look like it's from the period and all the rest of it. How would you go about, or how, as you mentioned, your research, how do you go about that? Or is it, as with most research, is you find a thread, you follow it as long as you can go, you find another, just talk me through kind of some of your processes and procedures in order to kind of do your research.
Well, if I'm looking for a forgery, it's extremely difficult to tell just from one object, especially if you're not able to physically examine it or test it yourself, if that one object is a forgery. But it's like dating something. They say something weird once, you're like, I don't know, are they a good person, are they not person? If they say something weird every time you hang out, you're like, oh yeah, you're not a great person, I don't want to hang out with you anymore. So what I do is I try and place that object into the context. So like what you did, your source said this person is not the sort of person who is selling authentic objects of this type. So sometimes I can trace the network of dealers and buyers and see, oh, this dealer is known for being very picky about forgeries. He rejects a lot of things. He's respected by other dealers. I can think he's more trustworthy. Or I can look at another dealer and be like, oh, everybody at the time is saying he's selling a mix of forgeries and authentic things, so you should really be cautious. Or here's someone who like just pops up into the marketplace with just this one thing and then disappears, and was like, also not a great sign. You can look at the money too. What are things being bought and sold for, etc. You can look even today actually at the other things people are selling. So one of my hobbies is to go onto eBay and look for bad fake antiquities for sale. I encourage everyone to type whatever area of cultural interest you have, and then follow that with antiquities and see just the ridiculousness that pops up. But I can kind of see things like if you are interested in ancient Near Eastern cylinder seals, so the little carved stone cylinders they would roll to sign their names 4,000 or so years ago. There's you might see one and think, oh, it's like $50, what a deal. But if you click onto what else that seller is selling, and you see they have 50 other cylinder seals, all obviously carved by the same person in the same style, and they're like in a cell. This particular seller I'm thinking of is based in Thailand. And you're like, all right, maybe one cylinder seal somehow ends up in Thailand, but not 50 at a time. So you got to use your brain, and it's amazing to me how many people they want something so bad that they ignore all of the red flags, just like dating someone, actually.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I like the analogy. It's a good way of comparing them. You mentioned about repatriation, and you were helping these Nepalese individuals get back their, I guess, as you said, it's not objects, it's items of their devotion or part of their religious practice, I guess, for want of better words. What goes into making the wheels move and turn in order to get that process even started? Because it sounds like you're up against governments, museums, vested interests, and then also on top of it, the Western cultural idea that this is our property and we've taken it and they've lost it kind of mentality. Like, what obstacles do you have to overcome to get that started? And do you have to kind of almost, like, is it a marathon where you're running this whole thing and making sure it gets over the edge? Because if you were, for argument's sake, to let it slip, there are thousands of other people wanting you not to kind of achieve the objective.
Well, I think the most important takeaway here would be there is no process. When
I first
started doing this, I assumed, it's like somebody has the list of rules about what you have to do, but there's just an overlapping mishmash of laws and museum ethical agreements, and even if there are laws, sometimes local authorities are willing to enforce them, sometimes not. So this might sound discouraging, but I think it really is encouraging, because it means that it's just all a negotiation, and you have to figure out what are the carrots and what are the sticks in the particular negotiation. So at least in the US, it can be much, much, much more difficult in other countries where museum collections are state-owned.
Yeah.
So France, for example, extremely difficult to get anything repatriated from France, because there has to be an act of parliament for every single object that leaves national parks.
Whereas, as you're saying, in the US, museum collections aren't state-owned, they're privately owned then?
Most museums are private nonprofits. And then the state-owned museums have actually proved to be more agreeable to returning than...
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, recently the Smithsonian Museums, which is the biggest federal system of museums, has come out and said, we do not want to have things that were stolen, that were unethically obtained. So we are going to do research, and we are going to be very open to any claims coming forward. And that's
amazing.
Really amazing.
Yeah.
So, well, let me tell you a little story of one of the first claims
Please.
I was involved in Nepal, a very short one, which is that I was contacted by an activist. I was contacted by an activist who told me that he had found a photograph of an idol, so to speak, an image of a deity is carved in stone, that had been stolen from its shrine in Nepal in the 1970s. So the photograph was of it before its theft. And he had matched it to the object. He had located the object in a museum in Colorado. And he had sent the photograph to the object, emailed it along and said, hey, I think this was stolen and you shouldn't have it. And the museum had replied to say, we're satisfied with the current state of our provenance research. So he sent this all to me and said, does that mean there's nothing we can do legally? And I said, oh, no. That's museumese for go after yourself. Yeah. Go away. And what we did was we brought the information to a local journalist in that town who published a story about it. And within days, the museum had been like, oh, yeah, we probably shouldn't have this, and repatriated the object.
What was the item, just out of interest?
It was a Uma Maheshvara, a scene of I can't remember which.
No, it's not a problem. No, it was more just at my own personal curiosity.
Either Krishna or Vishnu, but
okay, it was like a scene then.
Yes, it was a stone relief sculpture that would have been placed in a well. So you would get water, and you would be blessed by the deities while you were getting your water. So something that was a communally owned, used object, but also vulnerable to theft because it was out in the open. So what I was really doing there was, this is what I think of as my role, not to be an expert in Nepali cultural history, which I obviously am not, not really even to be sort of the legal representative at all, but just to be a translator, not from English to anything else, but from museumese and legalese to normal people talk, and to explain to American audiences what these cases mean to Nepal. So when you bring something like this to the public, then the museum could decide, do they want to keep it, or do they want to give it back? And if the public is saying, as it has said in a lot of these cases, like, what the hell? Why is this thing in the museum? Obviously it should go back. Then the museum realizes, to serve the public, to serve our American public, is not to keep this forcibly so that we can educate them, quote unquote, but to return it. And I think such returns really offer an expanded version of the museum's mission, because if you can, in exchange, get contemporary art, if you can get a video of it being reinstalled and being under worship, your audience in the US and Colorado can learn so much more about Nepali culture than they could from seeing this totally decontextualized bit of stone.
No, definitely. You mentioned earlier that you transitioned from ancient Mediterranean culture to kind of living cultures, and equally with the Nepalese people that you were helping, that's obviously a completely different area as well. What has it been kind of experiencing this issue of repatriation and items being taken? What is it like across the globe? Like, as in, is America, I would assume America would be easier for items to be repatriated in comparison to, say, Britain, because everyone has such a colonial hangover over here. And as you said, France is even harder because everything needs some type of legal act. So what has kind of the image that you've seen across the world when you're kind of dealing with this area?
Yeah, I think everywhere has its own difficulties. So in America, there are fewer people who are hanging on for dear life to these objects. But what I worry has happened in the last couple of years is that a lot of museums are saying, oh, yes, we should give these things back, but they're not actually devoting the resources or the time to actually give things back, because it does take a lot. You think about the hundreds of years that collecting these objects took. It's going to be an equally big, if not bigger, project to give them back. I think in America, the assumption that I wish would go away the most is the idea that, oh, well, at least these objects were preserved because they were collected. There is an assumption, even in very sophisticated, educated audiences, that these artifacts would have been destroyed or neglected or, crumbled to pieces in their home countries, which is just maddening to me. So if you go to Nepal today, you see objects under worship that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. They're doing just fine. This is what they were designed for. And a lot of these cases, when you're seeing the before and after photographs of something that has been stolen, it's been broken during its theft, because of the haste and violence of that theft. So it was just fine until the Western market said, ooh, sometime in the 70s, I like doing yoga, I like eating tofu, why don't I also get a Buddha to put on my mantelpiece or whatever, and then started, encouraging thefts from source countries. So I wish that would go away. There's also, in source countries, a real different range of desires or hesitations to make claims. I think there is also this attitude of preservation. Who has the skills to preserve things has been ingrained in source countries as well. So you'll talk to people who are hesitant to reclaim something because they are not sure they can care for it, and it's also like, but this monastery cared for it so fine for so long. Whatever. There's really, especially in countries that are not as wealthy, their governments have a lot of stuff to do, and cultural heritage might not be at the top of the list. Which is why it's exciting to see today so many more communities working directly to make claims. So they'll, a monastery or a family will say, this belongs to us. We'll get the government to sign off on the request for repatriation, but it's coming back to us. We're doing the work, directly involved. And I think one big issue, which is very frustrating to me, is a feeling of culpability. So often in these cases, there's some local involvement in the taking, and I don't blame anyone. When someone offers you a large amount of money, or what seems like a large amount of money, which is actually only a very small amount of the price an object would ultimately be sold for, it was hard to resist. And now sometimes repatriation claims cases will sort of run aground when suddenly people get frightened and stop talking about the history of the object, when they think, oh, people are going to blame my father or my uncle, or people will blame our family for not taking care of the object enough. Cambodia has done a really amazing job, legally and culturally, saying, look, we know that you were involved in digging these things out of the ground during the chaos of the Khmer Rouge period, but you had to feed your family, so can you please help us get back the gods? And a lot of former looters have come forward and said, all right, let me give you the information that will allow you to track down these things. So I'm hoping that kind of initiative will spread before people die, frankly, because the information needed to make repatriation cases is locked in a lot of people's memories.
I like the Cambodia idea, because it actually almost is just allowing you, we understand the context you people were in, we kind of, let's just let that slide and let's deal with the issue that we can deal with now. It's interesting. One thing that caught my attention whilst you were talking is you mentioned that kind of from the 70s onwards. Now, I guess it's also because of my area of interest is Sikh history per se, and so for me, my understanding of a lot of this forgery and just nonsense is kind of tied up with the British Empire and is kind of a few hundred years before the 70s. Do you mind just kind of enlightening me and obviously everyone listening, what when you refer to the 70s, like what are you referring to? What was going on obviously before and after, and how does that kind of tie into the work that you're doing?
Right. Well, it's interesting because every type of looted art has its own history of looting, its own histories of desire. So art from the Indian subcontinent has been appreciated by Western collectors for centuries. Well, let's say appreciated, quote unquote, because sometimes it was brought out to display the superiority over these primitive peoples who deserve to be colonized, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes genuinely, like, this is lovely and I want it, and I'm not going to think too hard about where it came from.
And some items were gifted. And I think, like, as in, although that wasn't the majority, I think that often gets ignored in the kind of the narrative of everything was stolen, which majority of it was, but in all of, like, in, I guess, in the guise of fairness. But yeah, sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no, and even some of this stuff was sold, but you have to think about the complications of what is a sale, what is a forced sale, what is a sale from people who really can't say no to whoever is asking, what is an unfair sale where, you know, I'm going to give you a pound of tobacco and take, you know, something that I'm going to sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which happened a lot in Africa and Papua New Guinea. So there are all these complex questions about what exactly, you know, if something appears on the marketplace, it could have come out of India at any time over the past hundreds of years. It could have had very, very different routes, and what each of these routes means ethically to us now is very debatable and different. What happens is that people assume, I think, that if there's a lack of information, if there's an information gap, you fill in that by imagining the history that accords most with what you want to see. So if you want to decolonize museums and think that it's all unjust, you're more likely to think, there's probably something stolen. And if you think, museums are wonderful places and that they wouldn't do anything unethical, then you think, it was probably sold legally, blah, blah, blah. So instead of tying myself up into too many knots about these ethical questions, I see my role as filling in the information gap, because then I think we can make concrete decisions rather than having these abstract ethical arguments, which is always hard to me to decide. And what I was especially attracted to the situation in Nepal was that it does not have, like India does, like Sikh art does, have this long history of collecting in the West. So Nepal's borders were functionally closed to foreign visitors until the early 1950s. And in 1956, the country passed a law banning the export of sacred artifacts and cultural heritage. So nothing that is outside of Nepal that left after 1956 left with the permission of Nepalis, except for a vanishingly small handful of gifts from the king, which probably even he shouldn't have given under his own law. But it's also interesting, so add to that the fact that in 1956, no one was like, oh no, we won't be able to buy more Nepali stuff, because nobody really cared outside of Nepal. People were interested in Indian art. If they in the West were looking at Nepali art, it was just as a sort of greater India offshoot of this art, which if you want to annoy a Nepali art historian, just say that, it's all just a variation of Indian style, right? Anyway, so it wasn't until Eastern spirituality became more of a fad in the West in the 60s and 70s, until the gas crisis was over and airline flights were more affordable, until hippies started to wander the world, including to Nepal, both for its spirituality and for the availability of hashish and drugs. Yeah. All of these factors come together. Some hippies start financing their lifestyle by selling antiquities alongside hash, or it's completely fascinating of a
That is
history.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So this so what you're kind of saying is that the start of this Nepalese art hijacking is part and parcel of the hippie movement. Incredible. I never knew that. And so yeah, please continue. So what? They're going there, funding their lifestyles, and then these items start making, like, how do they not get kind of caught up in the legality or illegality of things?
Well, again, in the 1960s and 70s, Nepal has a very low average income, and if you have U.S. dollars, it goes a long way, and you can bribe, you can hire locals, you can buy things in what might seem to be, and if you looked at one way, it might seem to be okay transactions, but looked at another, like, well, wait, does one family member have the right to sell a sacred object that is used in annual rituals involving the whole family or the whole community? That is held in trust not only for all of the members of a particular religious group, but all of the future members too. And I don't think so. I don't think that's right. And one of the pieces of research I've been doing over the last few years is looking at the archives of an American scholar who went to Nepal and purchased a bunch of stuff in the 60s and smuggled it out of the country, sort of at the initial wave of this interest. And it is fascinating to see this scholar's assumptions about what she's doing and the benefit of it. And she knows the law perfectly well. She knows the Nepal bans these exports, but she doesn't agree with that. She thinks that Nepal is modernizing, that people don't really want these religious items, that they're all converting to Hinduism, or not converting, but they're sort of marrying in. The Buddhist families are disappearing because they're marrying into Hindu families, and then everybody cares more about cars and transistor radios than about sculptures. So it's fine. She's rescuing them, quote unquote. And thankfully kept very good records that she then donated to an archive where we can look at them. And now I can go back to Nepal, or I can, sometimes I'll go into Google Maps, I'll see her describing, oh, this shrine is falling to pieces, it's totally an abandoned sanctuary, somebody should rescue this archive. And I go and it's like, no, it's still under worship, it's fine, it looks great, I want to go visit, like putting it on my list for next time I go back to Nepal. The cultural catastrophe that was predicted by Western observers has not come to pass.
It's really weirdly interesting for me, because these same arguments, and equally I'm sure you're more than aware of it than myself with the area that you research in, which is British, German officials. There was a German guy called Colonel Steinbach or something in Punjab before the beginning of the British Empire there. And he says this, they kind of all say the same thing. They're like, yeah, these Sikhs, they're going to end up in museums. Their items are going to be kind of part of the past. And essentially, if they don't sort something out, they're all going to be wiped off the face of the earth. And I just find it hilarious, because I'm sat here 200-300 years after reading it going, well, that didn't work out. Right? And so it's just scary, but equally weirdly familiar that those same arguments are then being repurposed a couple of 100 years and maybe a few 100 miles away from each other. But yeah, I guess that's just a constant at the moment in the way the world is set up, with the way all of these kind of artifacts and items are cherished from one view for their monetary value, but then valued for what they actually mean on the other side. I have to ask, considering you've researched and you've looked at so many different areas and items, what are, like, say, some of the most memorable items? And that could be for any reason. I don't know, it was something you found out about it, or getting it back to its rightful owner, and then it turned, I don't know, there may be some type of story or something that you're like, you know what, I remember this is something worth sharing.
Well, first I'd like to say that what you said about this excuse being common, it's so common. It's an excuse for stealing sacred artifacts from indigenous peoples in North America, in South America, in Africa, in Papua New Guinea, basically all over the globe. And there's never that I can see really a self-consciousness like, oh, well, these peoples are dying out for some reason. I have no idea what. So
Not 'cause
therefore I
of
must
me.
take all of their stuff. Yeah, it couldn't possibly be me. And what was I going to say? And it's also fascinating to me how people operating with this type of justification of we're saving something can point at others who have destroyed an artwork and say this is the worst possible thing. Like, think about the Bamiyan Buddhas, which I have to think about all the time because that is always brought up on Twitter by someone when I talk about repatriation. Like, oh, they're just going to be, this is going to go back to its source country and they're going to destroy it just like the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas. I'm like, ugh. But when I was in London the last time, I went to the British Museum and I went to the Indian wing, which I had actually never been to, weirdly. And I saw so many artifacts that had been taken from Buddhist stupas in India, including the sort of shielding, the marble exterior of almost an entire stupa, along with a lot of little reliquary boxes that had been dug out of the middle of stupas. And I thought, wait, what is so different than the Bamiyan Buddhas? You know, this Buddhist site no longer exists in India, not because you blew it up, but because you took it all to your country. So the end result for the source country is kind of the same.
The same. Yeah.
Just weird, just food for thought.
No, it's a good point. I think it's easy to use the Buddhas as a kind of an example of, oh, we should never return anything, but it's that typical global north argument against the global south. And I have to admit, I'm slightly kind of on the fence with it, because for argument's sake, India does have some really remarkable museums, but at the same time, there's lots of heritage in the north of India that has just been tiled over or has just been kind of destroyed and renovated. And then let's not even talk about Pakistan, because there has just been almost no effort to try to maintain or look after any of the historic structures that exist there. But at the same time, the items were taken, like Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's throne and the V&A in London, but fundamentally it was taken from there and fundamentally should go back there. Equally, I guess it's a little bit more complex because the Sikh Empire doesn't exist. So where does that go? And who looks after it? And is it looked after by a religious institution? Because then that changes the whole flavor of the item and the dynamic. But yeah, just putting that to one side.
Well, but I don't even think that is a counterpoint, because what I want to say is that, yeah, it's not that there's an ideal source country or like everything is birds and flowers and singing for any case, but the holding countries are also really bad at preserving heritage. Here in the U.S., are there sites of Native American heritage preserved? What about African American heritage and history? Like, so much has crumbled or been deliberately destroyed. So we should be in no way be up on the pulpit preaching to source countries about what you should do. Like, it's a problem everywhere, but including in the holding countries. And, oh, to add to that, um, there's often this idea of like, oh, well, the source country doesn't have as much expertise in preserving or curating or whatever. And what I ask is, well, how did that situation come about? Um, that, educational institutions are not as prevalent or available in source countries, and often you can specifically trace the history of suppression of knowledge about cultural heritage in these countries. Like the most ridiculous example is Egypt, where there various Western countries, including sort of led by the University of Chicago, established an Egyptology institute in the early 20th century in Cairo. But no Egyptians were admitted. It was specifically just to train Europeans. So the lack of source country expertise is not a like accidental whoopsie kind of thing. Yeah.
No, that is a good point. Can't get my words out now. One of the questions I would, and this is again just more so my personal curiosity, is the state of forgeries and fakes kind of the same thing across the board, or are there particular industries or particular, I guess, parts of art history that are kind of more forged or more duplicated than others? Because I know, for argument's sake, for Sikh history, you are probably 90% likely to buy something fake if you go to any auction house, and I would say it's probably between 90 to 95, to the point where I actually know a book. It's something called the I can't remember the full title, but the guy's name behind it is a guy called Gunuja, and he has a huge art collection, and I think he's based in San Francisco or in America somewhere. It took me 5 minutes to take one photo that he had in his book, to do some research on the internet and prove that it wasn't what he'd said it was in the book. And then I got blocked, and that was the end of it. However, I would just like to know, out of interest, like, are there some kind of some areas that are perhaps left alone a little bit more because they're not perhaps as lucrative, or it may just be harder to make the forgeries? And are there certain areas that are just flooded, like as in it's almost impossible to get through the fakes?
Oh, definitely. And really the central question is always, will somebody buy this? So there are very few forgers who are going to devote time and effort to making something that no one will pay them for. And the real sweet spot is to look for areas where people really want to own something, but do not look too closely or do not have the expertise to tell if something is authentic or not. So I am not surprised to hear that Sikh items are often forged, because this is common for communities where there are a lot of expats who have pride in their identity, who want to possess something from a past that they feel alienated from, either literally or metaphorically. So another area in which there are huge amounts of forgeries are ancient Iranian objects, because after the revolution, when a lot of Iranians left, they still wanted stuff, and if you came to them and said, hey, here's this ancient Persian whatever that was excavated illegally in the cave, and we smuggle it out from the regime, and wouldn't you like to save it by purchasing it? They're like, hell yes.
Please.
Yes. So especially when you can have that pride, that desire, and you can have a good cover story of why there's not a long provenance history. Another sweet spot for forgeries is something that people will buy and not show to a lot of other people. So erotic art, so many erotic antiquities are faked. because people want to buy them. And then, you don't put that like giant penis on your mantelpiece, or maybe you do. I don't know.
Well, who knows? Yeah.
Don't want to judge. But you probably show it to less people, so you don't get me coming into the apartment and being like, oh, sorry.
I think that's fake. Yeah.
And then maybe my favorite category of forgery is where they make stuff to appeal to buyers who trust in their own judgment. So there are also so many faked ancient Roman surgical instruments. And we have found some, like from Pompeii, the whole scalpels and picks and little saws that doctors would carry around. But there are like a bajillion that have been copied from the ones we have found to sell to doctors, to surgeons who are used to being the ones who know best and don't do a lot of consulting with others.
Oh my. That's so, like, it's such a niche area. Like, I would never have assumed that someone out there is making forgeries of ancient Roman medical equipment and then selling it to doctors, basically. Like, that is it's interesting, and equally I'm not surprised. The art market is just an absolute mess. So yeah, like, as in, I can see
it seems niche, but if you think about it, economic disparities mean that someone can make something, it's worthwhile to them to make something that might seem very not much profit to someone else. Like, Egyptian antiquities are a total nightmare for authenticating because from the early 19th century on, there are enough European tourists coming to Egypt who wanted to buy something. And, Egyptian villagers would come up when you're visiting the tomb and their sites and say, like, oh, you want to buy this? And often those pieces they had carved from wood scraps from actual tombs. So it's the right wood. They would sort of dab on some paint to make a little cow or whatever. And now, since the object itself is 150 years old, it's extremely difficult to tell what is real or not. And people would be buying these for the equivalent of a few cents. But if you were some farmer who had nothing to do in the evenings, why not?
Yeah. Oh wow. Okay. I just wanted to kind of spend the last few questions just diving into your book from 2022, Smashing Statues. I know we're a few years out of it being published, and I guess some of the discourse has kind of moved on. So I think perhaps a few years ago there were statues in the UK being toppled and thrown into the river, and then even with the the Peace March for the genocide going on in Palestine, there was then a counter protest by right-wing individuals in the UK to protect the Churchill statue, which wasn't attacked or touched or anything happened to it, but again goes to show the kind of the culture war being waged around these statues. What inspired you then to take this topic? The title of your book, obviously, Smashing Statues on the Rise and Fall of America's Public Monuments. Was there a particular event or something that triggered you to go, hold on, I need to have a look at this, or I want to take a deeper look at this, or anything?
Sorry, my building is shaking for some reason. Oh, really? All right, seems to have died down.
Everything okay?
I hope so. There's maybe a helicopter overhead or something.
Oh, okay. I was expecting. I just thought the worst, and I was like, the floor must be shaking. But a helicopter is obviously a safer bet. So.
Well, I can hear helicopters. The wall was definitely shaking. That's
Well, yeah, no, the camera was shaking, and then when you said it, I was like, oh, I hope everything's okay. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Oh, so what inspired Smashing Statues?
Yes.
So in the summer of 2020, during the initial stages of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, it was the pandemic. I have a family member who's immunocompromised, so we were very isolated. I couldn't even go to a protest march. I felt like there wasn't a lot I could do. And then I realized that people were commenting on the issue of monuments in a way that showed there are a lot of folks out there who made assumptions or had questions that I thought, I could help with that. People were asking, what's so wrong with statues of Columbus anyways? What did he do wrong? They were saying it's a mark of only uncivilized people tear down statues or remove monuments. And I'm a classicist. Basically every statue that I study has at some point been ripped down and thrown away into a pit and then reemerged. I was pretty convinced that Columbus's ties with genocide are not all that great. Why? And then I started to look more closely at these statue controversies, at all the news, and I started to have questions that I thought at the first were pretty stupid. Like, there are so many news stories about a monument, crane comes in, lifts the monument on off its base, puts it on a truck, drives it away, and I kept thinking, well, where are those trucks going? What's happening? And I thought, surely someone must be keeping track of this. All the news stories would just end at the truck driving away. And I've after a while I figured out, oh no, there hasn't been reporting on this. Those reports would also sort of talk a lot about why protesters wanted monuments down, the motivations of people to pull down something or to ask for it to be removed. But I found that very, very few of those reporters had actually interviewed someone who had been a protester or who had done an act of removal. So I thought, okay, there's a lot to be explored here. At first I thought I would write a book talking about why these types of statues are problematic, what sort of inequality they have enforced over their history. And then I realized, oh, no. Like, plenty of people know that already. That's not enough. I need to make more of a contribution instead of just saying something that, like, Frederick Douglass said in the 19th century. Sometimes I joke, but it's pretty a good characterization of my book that it's a by white people for white people guide to monuments in America. So, like, if you are kind of like, what's the big deal with this Confederate general? Like, read the book.
I love that. I love how honest and frank that is, and accurate as well. Touche.
But I also did enough research that what has been like the most lovely outcome of the book for me is hearing from activist groups who are working for the removal or recontextualization or whatever of statues, saying, that your historical research on the origins of this statue have added to our campaign. Like, it is obvious why this should come down, but you have added more support. Like, for the world's largest Confederate monument on Stone Mountain in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, I did a deep dive into the history of how that was carved and found it was totally like a scam run by Klan members to get donations, that they were saying were going into funding the monument, but then they were just like siphoning off all of the donations. So it's not really this like majestic historical artwork that people think about. It was mostly, for one thing, completed in the 1970s. Like, my grandparents have shag carpeting that's older than that monument. But also, like, we're not really honoring Confederate Southern history. We're honoring a scam run by the Klan. So it seems like not so great to me.
Do you think, though, that much of I guess particularly just in America, is kind of because of the loss of that information between, like, for argument's sake, the statue outside, like, for argument's sake, when you said it was outside Atlanta, it just confused me because that's such a predominantly black area, and then to have that statue, and then you've got the KKK, just boggles my mind. So I guess that's probably where this question comes from. Then is it kind of almost there's been purposeful ignorance, or maybe not purposeful ignorance, but there's been almost no need or not a want to really shine a light on it until recently?
I think you're right, because monuments have the privilege of being boredom. They are the background scenery to our lives, and the point usually is not to educate you about a particular historical event or person. There is a much different point, which you can see when you consider just how many monuments in the US and in the UK too are of white men. So in the US, it's something ridiculous, like 90% of public monuments are of white men, which, you know, there's plenty of great white dudes out there. But when you are growing up and you're seeing this is the type of person we honor, it sends a message.
Yep.
Just
definitely.
by ubiquity.
Yeah, no, definitely. As you mentioned, your book covers a wide range of public monuments, from Confederate statues like the one we discussed outside Atlanta to statues of Christopher Columbus that you were discussing at the beginning. What was perhaps the most surprising or unexpected thing you learned during your research about, and it doesn't have to be those monuments, it could be any monument, like for argument's sake, when you told me about the one outside Atlanta, that's such a shock. Were there any others that you came across and they were just uniquely fascinating for whatever reason?
Oh my goodness, all of them are so. So what I tried to do is write the book in a narrative form. So to tell, not to lecture anybody, because I don't know what to do. I'm not in charge of statues, please. I do not want to be. But I want to add this information to tell their histories, and they're fascinating histories. So maybe just, you know, how can I pick a favorite? They're all so good, but the statue I start off with in the preface to the book is an allegorical representation of freedom that still tops the dome of the U.S. Capitol building. This is a gigantic bronze statue that was made during the Civil War. So this hopeful sign of hopefully we will soon have peace, we will be reunited as a country, we will all be free together, except that when it was made, it was begun, except when it was, all right, you're gonna have to go back to, so.
It's fine, I can edit it.
Yeah. So I can't pick a favorite, they're all good stories, but maybe I'll just tell you about the first statue I start with the book in the introduction, which is that shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War, the U.S. Capitol building commissioned a sculpture of freedom, a massive, way over life-sized bronze figure of a woman to put on top of the dome of the Capitol building where it still stands. And ironically, one of the men who worked on creating this statue was an enslaved man, Philip Reed, who was owned by the sculptor Clark Mills, who had been hired to make this sculpture. So a representation of freedom as an American value made by an enslaved man is mind-blowing. And the fact that that's still up on the Capitol building, you know, without...
But I guess as one item, it's so symbolic of what America has been. Like, I think that is such a fascinating, harrowing, shocking, yet insightful statue into the dynamics around it. I guess also for someone like, for being over here in Britain, it just blows my mind. That's crazy. What it happened to the black man who helped to carve the statue? Like, were you able to find out anything more about him besides that he helped the kind of carve and make this symbol of freedom?
Fortunately, there was a wonderful professional genealogical researcher who had done a blog post about looking into Philip Reed's life, and she had traced him through records in DC. So he was freed when Maryland, the District of Columbia, freed enslaved people fairly early on in the Civil War, and within a few weeks, he got married. We have his records, and he collected his pay for making the Statue of Freedom. Or I should say, he collected 1/7 of what the government paid for him to work on the statue, because his owner, Clark Mills, received the pay for his 6 days of work, and then if Reed worked on Sundays, he could get paid by the government for that, what was on his supposed free day. And Mills also, we have his claims for compensation for being deprived of his property. So we know how much money he was paid by the government for having to free Philip Reed, who then went on to make a living as a plasterer, which would have been something he would have learned in Mills's workshop to work with plaster and make models. And then he died and was buried in DC within sight of the Capitol building, actually.
Oh, wow. It's nice to hear that he got his freedom, although obviously still having to deal with the racial laws and the rest of the mess that came with it. But it's nice to hear that there was some level of freedom in the gentleman's life. My last question, and I know you said you're not the kind of the president of statues, and you don't want to be either, but there's the debates kind of fizzled out a little bit recently with the pro-Palestinian peace march that was happening in London a few months, and it's still happening in London. The discourse has kind of plucked up a little bit, but nowhere near what it was when I forgot the guy's name that they threw into the harbour in Liverpool. It was a slave owner. That's it, yeah. Which is, obviously there's an ongoing debate about what should be done with these controversial monuments. From your perspective and from the research you've done and the book you've helped write, what do you think kind of should be the guiding principles for deciding what to do with some of these monuments and statues?
Again, professorly answer of it depends, but I think it really does. What they should be is truly public art. For the first time, maybe we think of them as public art, but really only a handful of people were usually involved in choosing the subject and putting up the statue. So I think they should be regarded as belonging to communities, and there should be a democratic process for deciding what should happen to them. And some communities will want to keep them up so that this history can't be forgotten. Other communities will say, hey, for example, we're a majority minority community. We know every day that there is horrible history and continuing racism. Like, we don't really need a big old statue in the middle of town to remind us of that. But there'll be different possibilities for what you do with that. Do you have another artist intervene to show that the community has moved in a new direction? Do you ceremonially melt it down to have a celebration of its removal to match the emotional intensity of the celebration of its installation? I think monuments can bring communities together when they leave as well as when they were put up. The only thing that I really think should not be a solution is to remove a monument and pretend it was never there. That's the real erasure. If you don't talk about it, if you don't acknowledge why it went up and what it was doing all this time. And I'm sad to say that most monuments that have come down in America, that's what has happened. They've just sort of disappeared into indefinite storage with no closure. So I was privileged to be late last year at the very first melting down of a Confederate monument. But that so far is the only Confederate monument to be permanently removed from circulation, so to speak. Everything else is in storage in what I sometimes joke is America's strategic racism reserve, like just in case we need to break it out again.
Well, it was just interesting whilst you were saying that. I was Googling what happened to the Colston statue that was defaced.
He's now on display in Bristol.
Yeah, he's back on
in
display.
In the museum, yeah.
Yeah, with the graffiti still on him, which I actually love. I think that, and again, it goes back to what you were saying. It's just telling another story on top of the story of that statue. So, fair enough. I just want to ask, we've been talking for over an hour. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've got through all the questions that I had planned. Is there anything in particular you think we should mention or you want to include or anything you want to add before we wrap up?
I think I want to take the chance to encourage your audience to do their own research. If you are passionate about something, it's not like there's some secret staff of experts on cultural heritage issues that is just like waiting to take this case in hand. No, it's a time of individual action and community action, and everybody can participate. And that makes it a really exciting time to me. We're in a time of change, and everyone should make their voices heard, so we can get to the future that we want to be in.
No, definitely. And equally, everyone listening, if you aren't following Art Crime Professor on Twitter, I don't recommend a lot of people often, but she's definitely someone you want to be following. The threads are fascinating, whether you appreciate or understand art or history or both or none. It's just fascinating. And I actually remember, I think, coming across some of your first threads. When I say first threads, when I first came across them, like maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago. And then I was like, "Ooh, this is interesting. She's saying the same things over here that people are saying over here." And so, yeah. And obviously, thoroughly enjoyed and really, really happy to have had the chance to talk with you. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, not a problem.